Hello and welcome. My name is Damir Marusic. I'm executive editor here at the American Interest. A little while back, I sat down with Washington Post columnist Megan McArdle to talk about the politics of inequality and how the elite consensus has resulted in the likelihood that we will have to pick from two extreme candidates from both right and the left in 2020. Have a listen.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and joining us. Is it, there seems to be some sort of crisis. Is it a crisis of capitalism itself, or maybe a crisis of confidence in capitalism? Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think, sort of looking at politics today in the United States, is it one or the other or neither?
I think maybe a little bit of both. I think that the economy genuinely doesn't seem to be working for certain groups. The most noticeable is low-skilled white males. And sort of for them trying to figure out something that is going to give them dignity and meaningful work as well as an income has proven pretty difficult. On the other hand, I think there is also just, you look at people who are in the kind of professional class, like yourself, like me, and like by any standards, we have it pretty good. Maybe we don't have it as good as other people we know we went to college with or so forth, but we have it pretty good, right? We have gainful employment. Our jobs are really cool. They're interesting. They engage us mentally. They garner a certain amount of respect. They garner a decent amount of income. But even those people feel terrified, right? Everyone feels like it's really far down to fall. And even if they aren't necessarily worried about themselves, they're worried about their kids. And that feeling of insecurity is definitely a crisis, but I'm not sure whether it is an actual crisis of like people are sensing something that's real about the economy, or whether it's just kind of a mood affiliation that has infected the entire, say, top 20% of the economy.
Is there an inequality problem? And, insofar as that there always is inequality in a market-based economy, is there a point where there is something like too much inequality?
Well, I mean, as you know, I believe you grew up at least a little bit in the former Yugoslavia.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
So even in a non-market-based economy, there's inequality, right?
Yeah.
I've heard stories about, right, like the fabulous, like the Writers' Palace in Lithuania, right, which is the minor Writers' Palace compared to Moscow, and yet somehow is like sort of these fabulously appointed clubs that people had access to and so forth. So there's inequality even there. But yes, there's inequality. Can there be too much? I think we really have to talk about what inequality means, because there's a lot of different things that inequality can be, right? You can have income inequality, you can have wealth inequality, but then when you take into account all of the fringe benefits of various jobs, you can have kind of consumption inequality, which is different from income or wealth inequality, even though they're, you think they're linked, they're not as tightly linked as you might expect, especially once you bring government transfers into the equation. You can have inequality in the kinds of jobs, right? Like, we wouldn't necessarily feel great if everyone got paid the same, but some people had really terrible, awful jobs and some people had wonderful jobs. Or if some people lived in terrible, awful housing and some people lived in wonderful housing, but it was all the same square footage, right? I mean, there's all of these different dimensions. They cluster, but they're not identical. Some of those kinds of inequality, and then there's mobility inequality, right? Is that I think we worry more about inequality when it's harder to move between groups, right? If you imagine like an ideal society where there's a distribution from 1 to 100, there's one person at each spot on that distribution, you're going to feel better about that economy, no matter what the gap between number 1 and 100 is, if, say, every year it's random who ends up in what place, right? Or it's entirely based on how much effort you expend, and everyone has the opportunity to expend exactly as much effort, so people are choosing, how hard they want to compete. then you wouldn't feel that bad about it, right? It's a very mobile society. The inequality is the result of a choice that people are making, trading off how much effort for how much reward they want. And that's a pretty good looking society. Is that the society we live in? No, there's all sorts of ways in which we don't live up to that ideal. But that same economy, right? If you get in, you're just born into number 1, number 20, or number 100, and you never move, we're going to feel very differently about it. And indeed, we might well feel much worse about that economy, even if the gap between number 1 and 100 was smaller than we would about an economy where there's a lot more opportunity to move, but the gaps are bigger, right? And so all of these, it's actually a very difficult question, not an easy one. But yes, I think in some ways there can certainly be economies with too little mobility. There can be economies where people don't have access to basic resources. And in that basic resources, I think we do have to include, Adam Smith has this wonderful passage where he says, like, look, if you're a workman, and all decent workmen have a white linen shirt, if you can't get one, then like you're actually suffering in some real way, in part because like linen shirts are nice, but also in part because people will look at you as the sort of layabout, worthless loafer who can't afford a white linen shirt. And so if something happens through no fault of your own, where you can't get to that point that is considered the society's decent minimum, then that's a problem. I tend to worry less about wealth inequality, because the thing about wealth inequality is that to some extent it's a fiction, right? Is very wealthy people can only realize a tiny fraction of their income in any given year, of their wealth in any given year as consumable income. If all of the wealthy people, say we took all of the wealth in America, and we decided we're just going to do a huge push, we're going to build infrastructure and all this awesome stuff. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to one time seize all the wealth of anyone who has more than, I don't know, $1 million, right? We're going to sell all those assets, and we're going to turn that into high-speed trains and so forth. We couldn't do it. Right? Because in fact, the price of assets would just crash. We could only get a tiny, if we sold off the entire U.S. stock market, we wouldn't get what the U.S. stock market is worth right now.
Right. Well, that's a problem with some of the approaches to doing this, and we'll get to that for sure. But so, I mean, hearing you at least sort of talk early, it's the things that concern you most are a kind of dignity deficit. I think you mentioned that earlier, and maybe a perception that mobility is being hampered, that it's the system is rigged and unfair, not so much that there are huge income gaps. Is that fair?
Right. I also worry about gaps in access to kind of real minimum things, right? Mm-hmm. If someone in America doesn't have enough food to eat, then I'm worried about that. And in fact, I'm worried about that even if everyone in America doesn't have enough food to eat, right? I'm less worried about the inequality as I am like people are malnourished, right? Yeah. If people don't have health care if we know how to cure a disease and we're not doing it for everyone, I'm worried about that. Those sorts of things I think are worrying, mm-hmm. but they're not necessarily worrying as a symptom of inequality. They would be worrying even if everyone was in the same boat.
Sure. So standards, basically, standards of living. There's kind of basic minimum that we want everyone to hit. Yeah. So, I mean, it's been a disorienting few years since Trump has come up, and he sort of scrambled categories. You consider yourself a person of the right before. Do you still consider yourself a person of the right, whatever that means?
Yes, I just don't consider Trump a person of the right. That's maybe maybe a little too neat in my definitions. I think of myself as the loyal opposition in a sense, right? In that I don't think that it's worth doing anything or saying anything to get Trump out. I think what actually really matters, I worry about his effect on American institutions much more than I worried about any short-term policy he has made, right? Policies can be undone. And by that same token, I don't want to damage those institutions in the attempt to remove him. And I'm afraid that many people have done that, have damaged institutions trying to use the power of those institutions to get Trump out. And I think that was a bad trade-off. Right.
But, do you subscribe to the idea that Trump's election was at least in part due to these things that are now roiling the Democrats as well, that this is just a different set of new approaches to maybe, assuaging this insecurity and maybe dignity deficit that we were talking about earlier. Is that what Trumpism is about? Just sort of quote unquote on the right, or on this populist right? How do you even conceive of that?
I don't know the answer to that. Everyone else seems to know what the answer is, and I'm not sure I do. I think the answer may have been overdetermined. Actually, I think there were a lot of things, not all of which are economic, some of which are. Right. I mean, there's my mom grew up in a little town in Western New York that had like a few small manufacturing operations, a lot of ag, was near to Syracuse, which had Carrier, and Rochester, which had Kodak and Xerox, which were big, prosperous manufacturing cities. And you see what's happened in those places over the last 40 years, and it's really grim. Right. The job market's just collapsed, and people have to move unless they can get a job in the healthcare, educational. Right. That's what's still there. These kind of government supported healthcare and educational industries, but there's no kind of native, we make stuff that people buy industry going on there. And even agriculture is consolidated to the point where it doesn't employ that many people anymore. And that's a real thing, but I'm not sure that's the entire thing. And I think that people really underweight. First of all, they underweight the fact that like people like to be around other people who are like them. And that this is true without disliking the other group, right? I mean, I think you can, resentment of immigrants and all of these sorts of things does clearly play a role. And Trump has addressed that in the worst possible way. But Eric Kaufman makes the point that like, you can have just a mild preference to be around people like you without necessarily disliking the other people. You just might want to be surrounded by people like you because there's externalities of having neighbors who are like you. It's easier to make a bunch of decisions if you have people who are just like you. It's easier to decide what the community standards for playing music loudly are. Is that allowed? When isn't it? But other things as well, right? There's just lots of ways in which your retail ends up geared towards people like you. All of your community institutions are geared towards people like you. That's a very comfortable situation to live in. People clearly have a preference for that. And indeed, I mean, sort of interestingly, right, the people who are most anti-Trump are also the people who are most residentially segregated in these very affluent communities composed entirely of people who may be racially diverse, but are like entirely like them by education and professionalism and all the rest of it. They really like being around people who are just like them. And I'm not in any way defending Trump. And nor am I saying that there's no racism among his coalition. There obviously are. And he is obviously like very reluctant to criticize those people in a way that's just we have not seen in any living U.S. president, and is just revolting and scars me deep to my soul to watch a U.S. president behaving that way. But I think there's also a group of people who just want America to be full of people like them because like that makes their life easier. Yeah. Right. But it's addressing, again, some kind of anxiety, perhaps, right? Fair to say that that's, maybe displacing, whether it's a dignity thing or these worries about the system, such as it were, displacing down to one pet issue of his, which is immigration, which has resonated with his base. Well, but I also think that like the immigration anti-restrictionists, and I count myself in their number, made a huge, huge tactical mistake. Or maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I think it was a huge democratic mistake, right? Which is we took the issue just off the table. We had a right-left coalition to never allow the restrictionists to get a seat at the table when this topic came up. And we ended up with this really weird, like everyone just agreed not to do enforcement on immigration, on the immigration laws we had. Without actually like taking the manly risk of going and putting in legislation that said, no, we're just going to basically not enforce our immigration laws, right? We should unpass them. No, that would have been difficult. So we just didn't enforce them. And I think that compromise seemed very clever at the time. I think I may have I feel like I gave an interview in which I praised it as a clever thing that we had done. It was unclever, right? Trump is the end result. of making people feel like if you get enough college-educated professionals together, they can outvote the rest of the country combined, right? Which is true, bad, and ultimately counterproductive. And I think that approach to politics happened on a lot of different areas, and that Trump, that a lot of people are just fed up with it. They don't trust us. They think we write the rules to benefit ourselves. They're not wrong about that. And I don't think that that's an excuse for voting for Trump. In the same way, like my analogy, when people would ask me about him, I would be like, this kind of sounds like my new fiance, like she's addicted to drugs and she steals from me and she beats my kids, but my ex-wife hates her. And that's not a good reason to marry someone, right?
Right.
I understand your grievances, but...
Well, so it's interesting how you phrase that, because arguably what one is seeing on the left now is that again it's that kind of failure of the elites model, and whereas Trump on the right, or you can contest whether that's the right, but currently on the political spectrum on the right of American politics has taken the previous orthodoxy of immigration and just attacked it and eviscerated it. You're kind of seeing that on the left with Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren above all, an attempt to really challenge the sort of economic orthodoxies, the more market-based things. How do you see these as really sort of out of the box shifts on the parts of the Democrats, or is it still within the broader spectrum of American politics? Would this represent, if either of them got the nomination and or the presidency, would this represent a serious lurch to the left for America, do you think, economically?
Oh, yes. What's interesting is that they sound somewhat similar, right? And they rail against corporations and billionaires and all the rest. But I actually think their idea of what the economy should look like is quite different. So I think Elizabeth Warren, her kind of ideal is a society run by upper middle class professionals. And maybe they wouldn't have quite so much income, but it wouldn't really matter because they would still live in approximately the same neighborhoods they did, and they would still have approximately the same jobs they did. It's just that people who are richer than them wouldn't have any money anymore. Right. And that corporations would look something like, I think, Germany's Mittelstand, right? There wouldn't be almost any churn in businesses, right? You could, if you already had a business, you could keep having one, but it would be harder to build one. And they would all be kind of small, and there'd be a lot of regulation that would make it pretty hard to get big. And the workers would get to run, collectively help run the company, which would mean they would get higher wages, and also that they would be pretty good, especially in concert with other people in their industry, from preventing upstarts from disrupting their industry. And that it'd be a much cozier, more restful and relaxing economy than we have, right? And I think that's kind of how she would and she would a lot of bureaucrats who make sure that banks can't do anything innovative with your mortgage, and that you would understand everything. I tend to think that is that she misunderstands the reasons that things like that are so confusing, but that's, an argument maybe for a different day. I think Bernie Sanders is genuinely likes the idea of Cuba. Right? He literally spent decades defending Cuba and Venezuela and so forth. He really likes the idea of, now I don't think that, first of all, I think the interesting thing about Bernie is that in some ways he has much more kind of respect for the law and the Constitution and process than Elizabeth Warren does. Elizabeth Warren is kind of the classic law professor. She works in a very bureaucratic area of law. She thinks of the law as something that you just use, you kind of just bend it however you need to get to the result you're looking for, right? And Sanders, I think, is much more of Adam Smith's man of system, right? He wants to set up this big clockwork machine that will, but I think that if he thought he could get it past the Constitution and the American voter, it's entirely possible that even after everything that has happened, Bernie Sanders would still favor, something much more radical than Denmark, which is really just like a free market with a lot of redistribution. He would favor something considerably more radical than that. And there are things that should frighten libertarians about both of them, different things. There are things that should frighten voters about different, and there are things that I understand the appeal, right? Like, I'm a libertarian. I love clockwork systems. I want everything to be like a big, giant clockwork. And I think I also, I have kind of Elizabeth Warren's aesthetic preference almost for the flatter income distribution of the 1950s and 60s. And the kind of feeling of security that not everyone by any means, that gets way over romanticized. And it's really interesting to read the literature and the movies of the period and compare them to how this halcyon vision we have of how everyone had this wonderful union job with a fat pension and all the rest of it, which is not how they saw themselves, and also not how the era shows up in the data. But it is a time when the economy is growing very fast. Everyone feels like they're getting richer, meaningfully richer, a lot faster. And that is appealing, right? That's an appealing world. And I would like Americans to live in that world. People, I think, really were genuinely less afraid economically than they are now.
Is the German model appealing to you? I mean, obviously there's a lot of difficulty to transplant something like that, given just, history and cultural difference. I mean, you don't just transplant it, but it seemed to me when you're talking about Liz Warren trying to sort of create this, the Mittelstand and the sort of approach to governing and running the economy. And now when you're talking about the 50s, I mean, those are not so offensive to you, even though as a libertarian, I'd imagine that you'd be quite worried by them.
Well, I'm like this weird nationalist libertarian in that, a lot of libertarians get very upset about what's happening in Sweden. And I'm like, I don't know if the Swedes like it. I'm worried about my system, not theirs. And no, the other thing is look, I've been to Denmark and studied their economy a little bit. Denmark is not some dystopian hellhole. It's a really nice place to live. I would not personally like to live there. Most Americans would not personally like to live there, even Americans who think they would. Danish culture is very insular. It's nice. They're really nice people. So I don't want to sound in any way like I'm criticizing Denmark. I'm not. It's just different. It's different on almost every dimension that you can be and still be in Western Europe. Or Iowa. I mean, there are parts of America that are heavily Scandinavian influenced, but it's a very undemonstrative culture. It's a culture that really prizes kind of keeping to yourself, keeping your head down. It's a culture that, the taxes are really high. The living space is really small. It's really hard but on the other hand, I really do. I like the fact that their public transportation is great. I like the fact that it's easy to bike everywhere. I would like to import some of those things to America, right? So it's not, but I would not like to live in tiny Danish houses and set my thermostat to 58 in the winter and all the rest of it. I wouldn't like that. I would really dislike it. And also as an American, I would find it confining. I would find the way that their culture is confining because I'm not raised to it. I was raised to American culture. And that is actually it actually matters, right? That very repressive isn't quite the right word, but they expect a really high degree of social conformity. And that high degree of social conformity makes a lot of stuff work in Denmark in ways that it just wouldn't here. So if you have a very high degree of social conformity, you have a high degree of trust, or you can have a high degree of trust, I should say, because you can predict exactly what other people are going to do if you give them their head and just let them go off and do some work, right? You know what they're going to do. You trust them, right? Because they're going to do what you would do, right? That's what social conformity means. We all do the same thing in the same situation. And when you have that, you, for example, do not need as much management. So, which is basically a productivity boost, right? So they have a lot less management supervision of their workers than we do, which means they can pay their workers more because it's basically their workers are all more productive because you don't have to watch them or spend a lot of time just telling them what they should be doing or making rules or enforcing the rules. All of that stuff they do, it's really minimal. Their contracts are absurdly short for an American. And Danes who have lived abroad tell me that inevitably when they go abroad, they get cheated. It takes them a while to learn how to live in a culture that is not that trusting or trustworthy. but there's real downsides to it. And like, so Germany, it's really hard to create new companies in Europe in general, right? They're like, you'll end up with anomalies. Like Norway had great numbers for 1 year and it was hilarious. Like the internet, I think it was 2010, was full of think pieces on how Norway showed that the Nordic model produced this awesome entrepreneurship and all the rest of it. And then it went down the next year because it had been just a blip because U.S. numbers were so depressed from the Great Recession. But in general, we create not just a lot of companies, because like France creates a lot of companies, but they're like bakeries. We create a lot of very fast growing companies. And those fast growing companies matter a lot. And here's the other thing, is if the smaller your country is, the less it matters what your policies are. Because the less, like basically economic growth, it's a bunch of things. It's your own institutions, but a lot of it is just basically what's happening at the global technology frontier, which is how much could you produce in an ideal society with all of the methods and technology we have available, right? And big countries just inherently push that frontier more than small countries because they have more people. This is not like big is better. Like the more people you have, the more innovation you get. Now you can dampen down that number with bad policy, but you're ultimately constrained by how many people you have. So if you are Denmark, you can have the best policies in the world. You're not going to be doing most of the innovation in the world because you just don't have enough people there. And so in the US, it just matters a lot more whether we have pro-innovation or innovation dampening policies. And while there has been some argument that things like Obamacare might promote entrepreneurship, zero evidence that that's true. Right. It's theoretically totally plausible. Just no one is actually like to get the evidence that people have produced, I should say, is like these super complicated regressions where you have a lot of researcher degrees of freedom. And you kind of wonder like how much p hacking went into those results. Even like people don't realize that they're doing that necessarily, but I tend not to trust a very complicated regression where you created some synthetic set of states that is to match with another synthetic set of states so that you can compare ones that say did or didn't expand Medicaid, right?
Right. Well, so
it's just...
Well, comparing then, what we're facing on the left, again, sort of just to get us back to the politics of this, because I think it's you're setting up on the one hand, America as it is, dynamic, evolving, but there's a not small chance that we're going to be faced with, on the one hand, some form of Trumpism, which is not exactly wedded to your ideals on the one hand, and on the other hand, Bernie and Liz, and maybe, between Bernie and Liz, I would imagine Liz Warren is less threatening to you, or like keeps you up less at night. Mm-mm. Fair to say, or the other way around?
I would actually prefer Sanders.
Really? Okay, interesting.
Yes, for a couple of reasons. One thing, and this is really probably like in a way silly, right? But I mean, I think we do tend to vote on kind of personal qualities, maybe more than we should, but everyone does it. Which is, for one thing, why I think that Warren resonates so much with wogs. They're like, she's just like me. She must be awesome, right? Is that Sanders is super sincere, and I am a sucker for sincerity. I don't, in a way that like Warren isn't. Like transparently, she doesn't care about. I shouldn't say it doesn't care about healthcare is not maybe the right way to put it. It's not her passion. She didn't want to do Medicare for all. She did it because she got fooled by Twitter into thinking this was a super popular move. It turned out not to be. She has been sort of trying to figure out what to do with that and kind of trying to like secretly signal that she's not going to do it while also saying she's going to do it. Right. Bernie Sanders is like, what you see is what you get. He likes Cuba. He likes national health care. He likes big government programs. But also, I think Sanders is not going to get any of this done because the constraint is the moderates in Congress. And he actually like genuinely doesn't want to do things through executive power. He really wants to push them through Congress. That's how he thinks, right? He wants big revolutionary change, not something that could be undone by a successor. Warren, on the other hand, knows the bureaucracy really well, and I think would do a lot of stuff with the bureaucracy and with executive orders and would push that as far as she could. I don't see a huge amount of respect for how I think of constitutional limits. And by the way, when we're comparing this to Trump, I will still vote for her over Trump. I will still vote for any of the Democratic field over Trump. So, the rejoinder that I'm sure any left-wing person, listening to this, reading this is, well, yeah, but what about Trump? Yes, what about Trump? No, he's worse. Give it, right? We're only talking about my preferences within the Democratic field. And so, I would actually prefer, I would find Bernie safer for the things that I care about. I also actually think, like, in a lot of ways, he is building what I would like to see in the Democratic Party, which is he has more support among white working class voters. He's reaching out to some of those people. For one thing, I think the Democrats need those people to win. I think that the idea that that some like upper class Democrats think that you can win without them, like that electoral map, if you have none of the white working class, that is a really, really, really like almost impossible electoral map. So I think he brings more of those people in. So just politically, tactically, I prefer him. But I think like he speaks to me more than Warren does. But on the other hand, all the other candidates I would honestly prefer to
either
Sanders.
Right, or Warren.
Yeah.
Well, so insofar as the question, if I'm understanding you also, is that it's the question whether the system is rigged versus a sort of inequality of income. The extent to which all Democrats are looking to do some sort of redistribution, you think that's just basically signaling, and that's normal politics. Democrats will always do that, and as opposed to Republicans, which will always talk about, the not necessity of do that. But in the broad scheme of things, this is not troubling to you, right? The fact that, taxes will probably go up under a Democratic administration. That's just par for the course, right?
Well, I mean, look, I think taxes should be increased because I think we should close the deficit because I'm a deficit hawk. So I think we could also do it by spending cuts, but no one seems to be interested in that. So, I want taxes to be increased. What I don't want is to increase taxes and then spend that money while not closing the deficit. But I'm also, as libertarians go, I am less of a tax nut than most. I think that the evidence that within the fairly narrow window within which taxes tend to fluctuate in the U.S., I don't think it has a tremendous effect on growth. And all of the non-Sanders candidates I see is probably staying within that window, right? Like if the top marginal tax rate goes back up to 40%, I just don't think that's going to move the needle significantly. If it goes up to 55%, I think now we're starting to talk about, while the base stays broad, meaning that that's actually close to the effective tax rate, then I think we're starting to talk about problems, but I don't see us getting there anytime soon, so I'm less worried. I think that I think the most worrying thing about, I think there are two worrying things about the Democratic field right now. Of all the moderates, Andrew Yang has a rationale for his candidacy. Everyone else's rationale is, look, I am not Donald Trump. And great, I support your not being Donald Trump. But okay, and you're going to be in office for 4 years. You can't just spend the time not being Donald Trump. And I don't think that any of them has much theory of government other than getting elected. And then Sanders and Warren, I think, have a very clear theory of government, and I think that theory is bad. So those two things worry me a lot.
I want to ask you about that, sort of theory of government. But let's drill down to something you've written about a lot is healthcare. The extent to which you look at, again, the options are, the Affordable Care Act, which is not doing well. You have on the right, basically, again, no real option that I've been able to discern, no real plan on doing anything about it. And then you have this sort of bandwagoning on the left to, any shade of Medicare for all, and then, people backing off from that as they get close to the center. But it's still not clear to me, there is some sort of drive to do something there, right? given that's going to be the choice, kind of the status quo that arguably was made worse by Obamacare, and then some sort of draconian things. How do you evaluate that? What's the right way to think about that?
Healthcare is really hard. And it is really hard in part because of all of the well-meaning policy choices we made in the past, which have blocked off any kind of rational system, right? I mean, the hardest thing about healthcare is that it's such a core, right? It is a deep terror to think you might not be able to get treatment for a loved one. And we are irrational on this topic. And I don't just mean I'm not saying it's irrational to want universal coverage or anything like that. What I mean is we're the mere hint of doing cost benefit analysis on this, which has to be done by someone. It's got to be done by your insurer or the government. It's got to be done by someone, right? But the minute you tell people this is happening, they freak out. I had this marvelous experience during Obamacare when it was being passed. I got called on to, I think it was the BBC, some British radio show. And I was on with a British health lord. And I said, and I was describing, they have this agency that does exactly this. And all wonks love this agency. And by the way, I was the designated, I was supposed to talk about how terrible national healthcare was. And I took the coward's way out. And I merely described what I saw as the political landscape. And one thing that I said was look, your country and mine have made much different choices about the healthcare system, and that constrains what you can do. So, for example, you have this agency called NICE, and it looks at new treatments, and it says, is this treatment going to save enough of what's called a quality-adjusted life year? Right? So, if we give you an extra year of life and you're just on a ventilator and in a bed, that's not a very high quality-adjusted life year. So what they do is they say, look, it has to save one QALY for every so many tens of thousands of pounds that this treatment will cost. And you do that, and that's really admirable in a lot of ways, but in America, it's politically very hard to see how we could ever do that. And I thought I was congratulating myself on being so diplomatic, right? And then the British health lord is like, that's not true. And I thought that you will have to take my word that if you go to the website of NICE, this is not meaningfully different from how they describe themselves, what they do. And so I thought there was some sort of weird misunderstanding. I was like, no, they look at a treatment and if it costs too much for the amount of life it saves or the quality of life it saves, they don't approve it. And he was like, that's a lie. And I was like, right. And later I had this conversation with a Briton who had happened to catch that broadcast. And he said, you have to understand, the NHS for Britain, it's like people toasted at funerals. And if you watch the 2012 London Olympics, they had a 10-minute dance number about the NHS. It was the most incredible thing I've ever seen for healthcare wonks everywhere. It was our moment of glory. And they cannot admit that they're rationing, even though every other wonk in the world desperately envies them and wants to replicate it. They can't tell the public they're doing this, or not very loudly, because the words, it is not worth giving you another year and a half of life if it costs 100,000 pounds. That's not something they can say. And because of that, because people are so attached to what they have to have a guarantee it won't be worse than what they have. And if they have very bad coverage or no coverage, fine. But most people have okay coverage. And so if you can't change any element of the system unless you can guarantee, not merely promise, not merely tell them, right, 100% ironclad guarantee that nothing about their coverage will be worse than what they have now, then you can't change what they have. And you saw this with, right, if you like your plan, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep them. And when that turned out not to be true for not that many people, the administration lost no time basically rewriting the law on the fly to grandfather in everyone's plans who'd had something before. And so if you look at that dynamic, right, you cannot alter any meaningfully large piece of the system. Obama had 60 votes in the Senate. He had the House. He had a huge electoral majority. And this had been the central issue of his campaign. There was no question he had a mandate. I think that mandate began to erode once people understood what was in office. But my point is that if he could do it in that situation, you cannot do it. And if you can't change any part of the system that already exists, well, all you can do is add yet another Band-Aid over the parts that are broken.
Right. But again, on the
unsightly pile, and the entire system makes no sense and costs $1 zillion.
The question, though, is that one of anxiety, right? Because, while fair enough, people perceive that they like the coverage that they have, and yes, Obamacare, I know from friends who've had to self-employed and, are have a family and are going on the exchanges and, their prices are rising. So they feel it in a way that if, like you and I work for a company, we don't see that element, the rise of healthcare costs. But still, the insecurity is the part, all these stories you hear is that, you get one, grave sickness in the family and it bankrupts everything. I mean, that was part of the enthusiasm for Obama, right? And there's, presumably there's some way to at least try to put a
generated by Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
It's not exactly true. It's not totally untrue, but it's not nearly as true as people think it is. But yeah, no, here's the thing, like insurance is a financial product. What is insurance really good at? Protecting you financially. And in fact, that's the one result no one contests from things like there's a kind of natural experiment in Oregon. And also Obamacare and Romneycare is like, yes, people who get Medicare coverage are financially better off. That's a real thing. People who get Medicaid are financially better off. That's like unambiguous. I think you would have to be an idiot to deny that. The question is, what about all the other stuff, right? What happens to your quality of care? Because people also care a lot about that. And the better off you are financially, the better insurance you have, the more you worry about that. And that is, I think, why the system is so impossible to reform, is that too many people have, yes, it's really expensive, but the coverage is really good. And it's really good compared to other countries that people like to praise, right? If you go to other countries and you look at what they do with funding, say, breast cancer treatments, we're much more generous, right? If you will get like more expensive drugs earlier in the United States, you don't have to come back and now like I've relapsed, right? You get it the first run, longer use, and all of these things. Our hospitals are nicer. I remember someone in Britain once saying to me, "Is like your hospitals are like hotels, right? Like all got private rooms and all the rest." Like I was talking to, I think now this was 20 years ago, but still, like I remember just being astonished that I was talking to someone who's like a fellow writer at The Economist, and his father had open heart surgery. His father was on an open ward 8 hours after his surgery ended. Right? Like that would never happen in the United States. You could be indigent and that wouldn't happen because we don't have open wards. They're just not a thing except in like tiny rural hospitals. Right? That's literally just not a possible outcome in America for anyone, no matter how poor they are. And other countries accept that, and that lowers their costs. It lowers the quality somewhat. It raises the risk of infection. It makes it harder to get rest and heal and so forth. There's all these trade-offs, and Americans only see the expense. They don't see the other trade-offs that contribute to that expense. Also, by the way, yes, like our healthcare workers make a lot. Our hospitals are really expensive. There's a lot of administrative bloat in the whole system. So it's by no means only open wards versus private rooms. But no American wants to trade off any of the real cost-cutting stuff that we would have to do to get actually down to, say, Canadian or British levels of spending.
Well, so let me ask you a question. It's a political one, maybe. A couple of wags I saw, I think were criticizing Liz Warren that her funding proposal for her healthcare plan was akin to Trump saying that Mexico will pay for it, right?
Yes.
For the wall. But the thing that struck me about that in many ways is that, again, Bernie, who's been running this sort of Medicare for all thing and not being specific about how to do it. There is something to the fact that you set the goal. And in setting the goal, like you were saying earlier, Trump exploits this hold on immigration that we had set the parameters of how we talk about immigration. He comes in and says, I'm building the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. And boom, now we're talking about immigration a completely different way. Is there something to the fact to say that, I follow everything you're saying about, preferences and what people are or aren't willing to give up in trading to get a different sort of healthcare system and outcomes. But is there some wisdom to just saying, Medicare for all, we're going to do it and we'll figure out how to pay for it? The equivalent of Mexico will pay for it, because then the discussion, changes drastically from a technocratic one of moving things around to just reorienting the goal, the political goalposts just shift in a profound way, and then we have a different kind of discussion about that. Is there anything to that?
I think a little, right? But the problem is that just fails at some magnitude of spending, and healthcare is way above that magnitude of spending. Healthcare would require us to double the federal budget. Right. I mean, that's a whole different level from, the wall. Obviously it was stupid to say that Mexico was going to pay for it. They didn't. I am dubious about the effectiveness of the wall as an immigration control measure, as opposed to, say, employer side enforcement, or better tracking of visa overstays. But that said, right, it doesn't matter, right? It's a lot of money, but in the context of the federal budget, it's a trivial amount of money. Whereas in the context of the federal budget, Medicare for all is just a huge amount of money, and I don't think you can hand wave, in part because I think people understand that, right? In a way that they understand that building a wall along the border, however expensive it is, it's not going to be 20% of GDP. Right, they're not going to personally actually notice the taxes to pay for the wall. Whereas people understand, if my healthcare premiums are $10,000 a year, and you switch that over to my tax bill, that's a lot of taxes. And most people, I think, intuitively understand that you can't just get it all from 5 billionaires. That it's going to have to come out of. And so this is where I actually think Sanders's revenue does not match up to his spending plans. But I will say that Sanders has been more honest on this than Warren, in part because, to go back to, Sanders actually really cares about doing this in a way Warren does not. Warren said it. She thought it would be really popular. That turned out to be false. It turned out to be not get her Bernie's base and alienate a lot of the people she wanted to go for in the suburbs. But at the time, that was the theory. And so what she's tried to claim is, I can do this all by taxing ultra wealthy people who have $1 billion or more than $500 million, or really, really, really hugely wealthy people. And the money just isn't there. They don't have that much of America's income. You could tax everything they make and literally not cover what you would need to spend to do Medicare for all at the federal level. And Sanders has said, no, I have to get the taxes from ordinary people. That's where the money is. Right. And so I think he's been a lot more kind of honest about it. But I think that also, also just highlights why Medicare for all in the way that he envisions is not going to happen. Could I see other Democrats doing something like a buy-in? Maybe. I think the politics are harder than people think, because that would really, really, really hit hospitals hard unless you raised Medicare reimbursements, which would then be way more expensive than you project if you just say, oh, yes, we're going to let everyone over 50 buy in, and we're going to pay their bills at the Medicare rates, which are about, 30% lower than the rates paid by private insurance. That's going to be a problem. But that I could see people doing. It doesn't feel that radical. It doesn't feel like it threatens anything that anyone has. What I don't see is ever, in a million years, getting the constituency to just do single payer.
On the question of, again, the sense that on both sides, on the left and right, that the system is somehow rigged. How do you look at things like tackling offshore tax havens? Is that important to voters? Is it it's an issue that has a lot of constituents about, especially in the wake of Russian interference. There's been all this talk about just dirty foreign money and how it affects politics. It's just something that keeps talking. Is that you think an important thing? Does that resonate with people? Because that's another thing that I think Warren is actually quite strong on closing these things. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I think the real problem is that, look, I don't like offshore tax havens. I think people who cheat on their taxes are immoral and wrong and terrible people. If you are cheating on your taxes, you are acting like a terrible human being, and you should redeem yourself by getting straight with the IRS. So there's my public service announcement for the year. So I think they don't like people who cheat, right? And that's totally correct. You should not like people who cheat. I may have my objections to the tax code, but you should not cheat on your taxes. And so, yeah, I think it resonates. And I think part of the problem is that the things that resonate with people aren't necessarily the things that make a big difference. Right. So that resonates. But what really resonates is when they find out that like a corporation has paid no taxes in like a year when they had big profits. And the reason that happens is that the corporation lost a ton of money like 3 years ago. And they lost so much money that they are still like basically working back to over a 5-year span, just having broken even. Right. And so what the IRS says is like, look, if you were a company that has variable income, we're going to tax you over your lifetime income, not like only tax you in the good years. And then in the bad years, you're just like, right. Because if that disadvantages companies that have very variable income over companies that have very steady income. And so like this is what they're called NOLs, net operating loss carry forwards. It's actually very good tax policy. But of course, people hate them because that's impossible to explain. Even when I'm saying it, I'm sure there are people rolling their eyes, right? And so, offshore tax havens in America, and like catch all the cheats, get them, like make them pay the money back, stick them in jail if they won't cooperate, fine. But this is actually, it's not that big a deal in the context of the U.S. tax code because America has been getting really good at cracking down on offshore tax havens. In fact, we've gotten arguably too good, not because we're getting a lot of tax cheats, but because for people who are not super rich people, but they're just Americans who live abroad, we've made their lives incredibly onerous with this law that basically requires any American who has a foreign bank account and lives abroad. Now the foreign bank has to report to the United States. And often the foreign bank is just like, you know what, if you're an American citizen, I'm just not giving you a bank account. And so for just totally ordinary middle-class expats, I'm not sure that the craziness we've put those people through is worth like the small amount of tax cheating that's enabled us to help. The really big deal is stuff like cracking open secret bank accounts, right? And telling banks that if someone has $100 million in a bank and they're an American, I had better damn well know about it. And if I don't, like, you are going to have some serious trouble with American regulators, right? I don't think to know about everyone who has $13 in a Canadian savings account, but we do because FACTA. So I think that that's actually not that big a deal anymore. And I think we should still go after them, great, but I don't think that it's a meaningful way in which the system is now rigged. I think the ways in which the system is rigged are like quite complicated, very hard to cure. And it's like corporate depreciation on corporate jets, right? It doesn't even raise any money. That whole Obama talking point, right? But it sounds like it does, and it sounds terrible. And if I didn't know anything about tax policy, I too would be like, how dare you, evil rich people, be like stealing money from the taxpayer with your corporate jets, right? And so, the problem is that all of the fixes for these things to change like very small amounts of chiseling. And I'm not talking about the people who used to like just be able to pay no taxes for decades on end, which was a real thing before 1986. But it hasn't been true since 1986. But the little things that we now get, like, should you be able to depreciate your corporate jet over 8 years or 15 years, right? Which is like, it just changes the timing of the taxes. It doesn't even change how much tax you pay. That stuff, you keep trying to close that loophole, and then you just create more loopholes, because the more complicated the tax code gets, actually the easier it is to find new loopholes, because now it's not even possible to know whether you're in compliance. And this creates its own sorts of uncertainty and complexity. And everyone has to have very expensive tax attorneys if their taxes are even a little bit weird. And that stuff, you can ask people who are self-employed about this. It's a nightmare. When my husband and I got married, that was the year that I was like, we have to get an accountant, because we're both journalists. We both have a little bit of outside income. And I couldn't tell, right? It wasn't that I was like, I can't do the math. It's that I had no confidence that I even knew whether we were complying with the law. And like a normal person who just sells some freelance articles occasionally or gives a couple speeches should not be in the position of not being able to determine whether they were paying the legally owed amount of taxes. And I'm like pretty good with math. It was not a math problem. It is just like the law is too complex. And so those are real costs that we have to think about. So yeah, I think they do resonate politically, but the problem is, like, I'm not actually sure if there are good fixes for them as opposed to things that sound good and actually just make the problem worse.
So you think there are no...
Sorry, that was a long story short.
Not at all. But I mean, so you feel like there are no easy fixes to this. I mean, in one of your recent columns you wrote, you were referencing Richard Reeves' book, Dream Hoarders, and, you made the point that it's, that's the top quarter versus the bottom quarter distribution and the sort of the inability for citizens to move between sort of this is more about income mobility than anything else, it seems to be saying. But again, I went and looked up the book. It's the prescriptions also seem kind of small bore and not that convincing in that, right? I mean, it was need to open up the system and in general. So in a sense, we seem to recognize we have a problem, but all the sort of solutions are either seem to be signaling and cosmetic and perhaps not really getting at the bottom of it, or economically disastrous or illiberal, right? I mean, that's sort of the pickle we're in. So are we in a crisis? Again, sort of ask the question.
Well, so let me raise an interesting observation, which is like, before World War II and up until the 1950s, elite colleges are really elite colleges, right? There's these, stories, these are really true stories of people, of elite guys of the old kind of WASP aristocracy. They would have their kid and then they would rush out as soon as they knew it was a boy. They would rush out and write off to put their son's name down for Groton and then for Harvard. Right? Like, and by the 1930s, there's a little less of that. There's more by competitive exam, but still it is essentially like, it's not nearly as much to do with ability as where you were born. And then in the 50s, that just changes, right? By the early 1960s, while there are certainly legacies and all the rest of it, like essentially the Ivy League is admitting a lot of strivers from families who immigrated a long time after the Mayflower, or who immigrated on the Mayflower and then they ended up as dirt farmers in Oklahoma, and then, they didn't really do much for the next 200 years, right? That is a major change, and it was voluntary. No one made them do it. There was no legal case. They just voluntarily decided, like, the system isn't fair and we should have a fairer system. And what I see now is that the children who were admitted to those schools are now busy constructing exactly the moats that they were so desperate to overcome, right? To protect their own kids. And it's totally understandable. On an individual level, everyone is doing the right thing. They're trying to give their kids the best life they can, right? It's just that systemically, the system should not be set up so that it's easy for you to make sure that your kid is going to have a great life by making sure that other kids have a really, really, really hard time getting the same shot at good jobs or good educational opportunities as your kid has. And that is kind of what it looks like. And again, it's not like anyone sits down and they're like, how do I make sure poor children are going to be stuck being poor, right? So I'm not saying this is malevolent. This is a big mistake that I think Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders especially make, is that they assume that if you get something that like looks like what a malevolent person would do with a really bad desire, like an explicit desire, that therefore there must be someone out there like that. No, you can get emergent results that look like that. And they make this happen by, when they're hiring, they hire people who are just like them and they want elite college degrees, and they don't even ask, like, do I actually need a college degree? Right? So I was in tech in the 90s, and like some of the best people I had either had no degree or irrelevant degrees. Like the best tech guy I ever knew had a religious studies major from Swarthmore. And the best tech guy he ever knew was an Orthodox guy who had started working in a camera store on 47th Street in New York. And we had a guy who had been a porter at one of the buildings where we were installing a network, who first we hired to do cable and then ended up configuring network routers, right? There's just an astonishing amount of mobility, and it didn't hurt to have come from an elite school, but it didn't really help either, right? And that was the world that I think of. That's my ideal, right? And the ideal starts with saying, like, it doesn't actually matter whether we need more entry routes. That doesn't matter so much whether you have a college degree. If you're not the sort of person who's good at sitting in school, and people aren't, but also they're like my grandfather, who just wasn't academic. My grandparents had like 5 books in their house, and I think 3 of them were biographies of Nancy Reagan, and one of them was a Bible, right? And like, but my grandfather had a great life as a small businessman because you didn't have to be good at being in school to have a good life in 1940 or 1950, and now you do. And the whole system is the problem, right? It's not any malevolent person, but some of it is things like lawsuits, right? Is you can always defend a hiring decision if you asked for a college diploma. Some of it is that, like, it's so much easier to apply for jobs now because of things like Monster, that people are just filtering down the resumes they get by arbitrary degree cutoffs. Some of it is that HR departments are bigger and they like rules, right? Because it's not the direct hiring manager who's making the ad. It's some person in office who needs very explicit instructions. It's all of that stuff and more of that stuff. And so what it actually needs is at every level to be really conscious in the way that those people in the 50s were conscious of how are we making the world worse by making it too hard for good people who are willing to work hard to get where I am. And how could we change our criteria so that it would be easier for those people to get where I am? We don't think those things. Like, we sit around and we have talks about diversity and so forth. We have committees about it, right? And maybe if we get to the point where we've got like an applicant of color and a white applicant, and they're totally equivalent, we hire the woman or the minority because we want to diversify our company. And like, I am not, a lot of like conservatives, certainly some libertarians are like, and that's appalling, it should be race blind and gender blind and all the rest of it. And I don't think that's true. I think it's valuable to have people who are not like everyone who's already in the company. I think and I also think, frankly, that especially institutions like education, their job is not just to, if your job is to form the elite, then society has an interest in making that elite look as representative of the country as possible. I would only say that I think they're far too narrow in how they construe what representative of the country looks like. I would like to see more affirmative action, not less, for all sorts of, but keep the stuff we have and then think about other ways that it should be representative. But I also think that beyond that we shouldn't have put colleges exclusively in the business of determining what the nation's elite is, and we have, and that is a big, big, big problem. And it will be solved at the individual level. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, so in the sense that it's solved at an individual level, it seems to indicate that maybe it's as much as we said at the beginning, sort of maybe a crisis of confidence, and we need the kind of maybe optimistic leadership that is. We're in a time of pessimism now. It feels like, right, that both on the right and the left you have a kind of defensive crouch and a reaching for sort of rejiggering everything because it's not working. But it sounds like you're saying in general a sense of optimism and more openness, personal responsibility and commitment to a kind of altruistic egalitarianism. And that could be perhaps just reawakened, with the right kind of leadership, the right kind of disposition among our leaders, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not a utopian, right, by any means, but I think part of the problem is that we're so focused on the government, and in some ways that becomes an excuse. And I'm not saying government policy shouldn't change in many ways, doesn't have a role to play, and so forth. I'm not saying that Donald Trump's erosion of civic norms isn't terrifying and terrible. But I am saying that, like, screaming about Donald Trump on Twitter and maybe going to a protest march is not a substitute for looking at your own life and asking, like, how could I be making America better today? How could I be making my community better? How could I be making the world better? Right? Is that, unfortunately, it feels like a substitute. You feel like I'm a good person because I said all the good person things. So now I'm going to go back to figuring out how I can like get into a super wealthy enclave where my kid will be around no one but other kids like them, and how I can figure out how to keep that enclave wealthy, although I will never say that's what I'm doing. I will talk about, noise or traffic or community or, whatever it is, but I will and never say the words, but know in my heart what I'm doing, right? Like, you have a personal responsibility to just not be like that. And maybe it is naive and Pollyannish to think that just exhorting people to be different can change them on the margin. I don't think that we're going to, have some great awakening and America is going to wake up and everyone's going to be like, but I think that, if everyone just acted 5% better, that would be a huge improvement in American life. And I include myself in this, right? I should do more too. So I'm not like, what's wrong with you people? I should do more in my everyday life. We all should. But the way, and this goes back to what I was saying about Denmark a little bit, right, is that we do need leaders who focus us on that, because it's a kind of coordination problem. Is like, if we were all 5% better in our lives, then America would improve a lot. Our communities would improve a lot. But if I'm just 5% better, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the negativity, right? And so what I would like to see is people who are more focused on saying, and something like John F. Kennedy, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I would also say, ask not what your country can do for others, ask what you can do for others. Not to say that you can't support universal healthcare or whatever, but also, and what have you today done for another human being to measurably improve their life? What have you done to make your community, your company, kinder and more inclusive, and not just on the metrics that society is handing you? Have you actually just thought about who are people who we're not even thinking about right now who might have a hard time getting here? Who are people who might feel like I'm insulting them? I think this is something that journalists could think a lot about with Middle America, is how are the unconscious ways in which I am communicating that I think they're kind of like a weird species of alien, right? All of those things, if we did that, yes, the country would heal. Whether we're going to do that, maybe this is utopian. I tend to I tend to believe a lot in the power, but here's the thing. I'm going to close with a story. And I always think about this whenever people say, America is so broken and all the rest of it. So when I was working on my book, I stayed in this incredibly cheap hotel in Memphis, and not in a good neighborhood. And I had to be at bankruptcy court. I was reporting on bankruptcy court. So I had to be at bankruptcy court first thing every morning. And I started to pull out of the lot and I backed up, and I have a tiny little car. This was a very large rental car. And I heard a crunch and my heart sank. And there was a second that flitted through my head. I'm really not proud of this, but I am going to admit it, that I could drive away and no one would know. And then my better instincts overcame me. And the reason I wanted to drive away was not to avoid paying for it, although I was on book leave, had no income, and was super broke. It was that I was late to court. And I was supposed to meet with a judge, and I was like, oh God, this is going to take forever, and then I'm going to have to explain that I can't drive. But so I got out, I wrote my name on a note. I looked, it's bad. It's still dark, so I can't see really well, but the bumper is hanging down off the car. And I was like, oh God, we don't have any money and this is going to be bad. So I write my name and my number down and on the note, and I put it in the car and I drive off to bankruptcy court. And all day, I'm just chewing my nails and waiting for the call, both because I'm going to have to apologize to whoever is probably not near their home body shop, but also because I don't have any money and I'm not going to want to put it on my insurance. And also I have a high deductible and I don't know where we're going to get what looked like $1,000 repair to me. So the phone never rings and it doesn't. And then that night I drive into the lot and the car's still there and I see something that I had not seen before, which was that the bumper is indeed hanging off and it is secured there by duct tape. And that I didn't think I'd been going that fast. And indeed I wasn't. That's just what the car looked like. it was like, it had Bondo all over it. It was bad, right? It was clearly the person who owned this car did not have a lot of money either. And that person, they could have called me. They could have told me any amount of money within reason, and I would have just been like, okay, I'll meet me somewhere and I'll give you a check, right? Or I'll get cash. Actually, I guess I didn't have my checkbook with me because I was traveling. But I would have just given them the money. And they didn't. And they could have. And so when you think that like people are all cynical, like I don't know who this person was. I don't know whether they were black, white. I don't know anything about them except that they were American and they were in the service because they had a naval uniform folded in the back on the back seat that I saw when it was light. But that person made a decision to do the right thing, just like I made a decision to do the right thing for a person that I didn't know. And that is America. And we do those things every day for each other. That is not rare. It's a nice story, but it's not a really that shocking story. And it's not a rare story. And if we just think about like upping that a little bit more, the economy would be better. We could be more like Denmark in that way. We could be more productive. Our politics would be better. Everything would be better. And that is actually something that like each of us, no matter what you have in your life, no matter how hard things are, each of us can contribute to that, to making America just a little bit better. And I do believe that it's there and that it could be there more.
Megan, thank you so much.
Thank you.